And honestly, I think that kind of takes care of bishop d7, which is the most commonly played move in this position. Rook b1 has not actually been played all that much, so it's a nice little surprise for the opening theory. I think black's best move is knight c6. And this is a little bit scary for black to play because he has to worry about things like d5. Which is definitely a move in this position. And in particular, black has to, in order to play knight c6, he has to kind of calculate that after d5, a6 is a strong move. Notice, even in this is an interesting try for white too. Even here, white can play bishop e2, bishop takes, bishop d2, bishop takes, queen takes, knight d4, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes. And I would say this position is dynamically equal. For example, castles, and there was a grandmaster game here that went h4 with reasonable play. The only drawback to this position, white would really be much better if he could do bishop h6, but the problem with bishop h6 is queen a5. And let's say king f1, f6, or something like that. We have a dynamic game here. Black shouldn't complain. But that's also an option for white if you want to play more dynamically than what I'm going to recommend here. So knight c6, black has to be aware of these tricks in order to play it, and that's why it's not played quite as much as bishop d7. So let's look at castles, bishop e3. Now, I think black is fundamentally okay here, but he's going to have to be a little careful. There's two main variations for him, really. First, let's look at the natural bishop g4. Then we could see d5, knight e5, bishop e2, and probably black should just trade everything off. And he's not winning the pawn on c3 because we have rook c1 at our disposal. So we could get a position like this, queen a5, rook c1, and I think it's roughly equal. Nothing too special. Maybe I'd rather be white just because white has some chances to play moves like bishop g5 and maybe e5 at a later point. So this would be one of the standard positions you get if black plays absolutely perfectly. And of course, there's no big, danger here for white. So another way for black to play is pawn takes, bishop g4. This is to deny d5. And now we'll simply take. And this position has been reached a number of times, and white's done fairly well. And the main thing is to realize that there's this is basically a dynamically equal position, but black has to find the move here, which only a couple players have found. For example, several times, twice against Kramnik actually, once in a blitz game against Kasparov and once in a real game against Shirov, black played this and took on d4. The problem is, though, after rook fd1, white has a sizable advantage. For example, c5, rook c5, and in both cases, Kasparov and Shirov both took on c5, and of course, though this endgame isn't so good here for black. Okay, so and then they both lost those games. So it was really kind of surprising that both such strong players played exactly the same way and the same mistake in those positions. And for example, let's say queen d7. This is a move that a lot of people have played. h3, bishop f3, queen f3, and if bishop d4, still rook fd1 with a lot of grief. Notice e5, bishop h6, we're not only threatening the rook, but we're threatening mate. So queen d7, natural looking move, doesn't work out so well. The most commonly played move by black here is queen a5. And this is typical for Gruenfeld players, is that they want to solve their opening problems with activity, which is a laudable goal. But here, rook c6, say queen a2, rook c7, I kind of think of this position as a typical Gruenfeld advantage for white. Because the pawn on a7 isn't going to hurt us for a long time. And before it does, we're going to be able to make grief against the black king using our extra pawn. It's like we have an extra pawn in front of the king to fight for an advantage, trying to open him up over there. So this is a pleasant position for white. Some games have gone queen e6, h3, queen d6, rook c5 with an advantage to white. Notice bishop f3, queen f3, bishop d4 fails to rook d5. So, black has to actually find a very difficult move here. Rook c8. Why is it difficult? The point is that it's not just that we're protecting the pawn on c6, but we're trying to threaten bishop f3 and bishop d4. So, for example, if white goes about his business with h3, bishop takes, queen takes, bishop d4, rook fd1, c5, now the rook protects the pawn. And it's a kind of a sly tactic with rook c8 that many black players, including the strongest, have not seen. So, in this case, white's best, I think, is rook c5. We're preventing the movement of the c-pawn. We're preventing queen a5. And black here should be a little cautious. If, for example, queen d7, now we can play h3. Bishop takes, queen takes, and bishop d4 will not work due to rook d1. So, black's best, really, is to play bishop f3 immediately. X-clam. And now with queen f3, bishop d4, rook d1 isn't so hot due to e5, rook e5, bishop e5, and black is fine in this position. So we have to humble ourselves a little bit. GF. I think this position is dynamically equal. Maybe I'd rather be white a little bit more. A sample variation could be queen d7, threatening queen h3, king g2. Various moves, obviously, black can do. If he does nothing, though, we're going to play things like queen a4 and build up on the c-pawn. f5, d5, and I think it's essentially, let's say you took on d5, probably roughly equal. Let's try f4. Let's say black tries to ambitiously hurt us here. Bishop d4, and here's a nice trick. Queen d6, rook c6, rook c6, bishop g7. Now black's best is probably king g7, dc, queen c6, queen d4. We'll take on a7. Black's probably still active enough, though, to hold the position. But if he goes for more, rook d8, then we have a nice trick with queen d4. Let's say the rook moves, bishop h8. And white has a very pleasant advantage now. We could continue king f7, queen g7, king e8, queen h7. And white's better because the black king will always now be on the run, and this bishop is actually very strong. So, as promised, this is a kind of a simple way of playing against the Gruenfeld, and I'm going to back up a step. And one way to think about it, at least the way I'm thinking about it for myself, is that this bishop b5 check is a very nice option. And of course, if you're a black player, you'd want to know about knight c6. And if you feel like, let's say you've already tried it on your opponent, then you can do something else. And in particular, if you feel that bishop b5 doesn't have any teeth against whoever you're playing, then rook b1 is the next alternative to think about. And that's a lot more involved, though. That's a lot more involved for whites who know, and black will have prepared something against this. So this is GM Jesse Kraai, hoping you found this little introductory lecture on a very simple system for white useful. Bye-bye.